The late October wind ripping through the skeletal remnants of Detroit's industrial spine tasted like rust and failure. 33 years old, and Kai Stone was measuring his life in half-paid electric bills and the growing anxiety in his chest. A former engine company firefighter, his left knee was now a map of titanium screws and regret, ending his career and shunting him into the purgatorial half-life of side hustles. Right now, it was storage unit flipping. It was a grim lottery. You bought a sealed life, the detritus of someone else's collapse, and prayed for a vintage fender or a cache of unopened comic books. Anything to keep the tow truck from claiming his beat-up Ford F-150. Most of the time, it was just moldering memories and debt. This particular Tuesday, the auction was held in an abandoned stamping plant parking lot. Rain slickening the pitted asphalt. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and hopelessness. Kai was eyeing a unit, a standard 10 by 15, packed solid with what looked like expensive, if water-damaged, photographic equipment. But the bidding quickly climbed out of his price range. Then, the auctioneer pointed to Unit 14B. It wasn't a standard unit. It was an exterior-facing, cinder-block bunker tucked beneath an old, rusted rail spur. It had no roll-up door, only a reinforced steel access hatch, the kind you'd see on a civil defense silo. The paper tag zip-tied to the handle was yellowed with age, and the auctioneer barely gave it a mention. Unit 14B. Unclaimed since '98. Owner paid a year in advance. Never contacted again. Contents unknown. Could be empty. Could be anything. Starting bid, $50. The usual flippers scoffed. Too much hassle, too much potential for toxic waste or structural damage. Kai, nursing a lukewarm coffee, raised his hand. 50 to the man in the dirty parka. He won it for $75. It was a stupid gamble. A financial Hail Mary. But something about the utter finality of that steel door, that promise of absolute silence, drew him in. The lock wasn't a brass padlock. It was a massive quarter-inch thick steel plate welded to the hatch frame. Kai stared at the cold metal. This wasn't storage. This was a vault. He had to drive back to his apartment for his angle grinder and a fresh cut-off wheel. It took 40 minutes of grinding, the screech of steel against steel echoing off the nearby abandoned warehouses, before the welds gave way. When the plate clattered onto the concrete, exposing the latch, Kai inhaled deeply. The air wasn't stale. It was cold, dry, and carried a faint, disturbing scent, like ozone mixed with burnt copper. He cranked the heavy wheel handle. The hatch opened with a long, drawn-out hiss of displaced air. The interior was not a storage unit. It was a small, square room built entirely of concrete and reinforced with thick steel ribs. There were no dusty couches or mildewed boxes. Instead, the space was dominated by a heavy-duty industrial workbench bolted to the floor, surgical lamps hanging over it, and shelving units lined with crates. Everything was meticulously organized. Too organized. On the workbench lay tools Kai didn't recognize. They weren't standard hardware. They were long, slender rods, some tipped with razor-sharp obsidian, others made of a dull, dark metal that felt unnervingly heavy in the hand. A mix of copper and something else. He recognized the heavy, oiled leather of weapon holsters, but instead of pistols, they held bizarrely shaped, intricately carved implements that looked like a cross between ceremonial daggers and medical instruments. Beneath the bench, bolted shut and secured with an electronic combination lock, was what Kai assumed was a filing cabinet. He'd deal with that later. The first genuinely unsettling thing was the shelving. Everything was labeled, not in Sharpie, but with precisely stenciled, often coded lettering. Crate 3A. Titan and Bone Dust. Against Mimic Variant Beta. Asterisk. Crate 6F. Liquid Alchemy. Purge and Seal. Do not shake. Asterisk. Crate 11H. Censer. Last Hope. Copernicus resin. Kai felt a profound, chilling sense of intrusion. This wasn't abandoned junk. This was someone's life, and that life revolved around hunting things that didn't exist in the real world. He walked toward the back wall, where a simple metal wardrobe stood. Like the workbench, it was fastened to the concrete floor, not bolted but welded shut at the base. It was the same grade of steel as the outer hatch. Curiosity overriding caution, Kai pulled out a battery-powered grinder and attacked the 4 welds holding the wardrobe in place. The sparks flew, lighting up the bunker's sterile darkness. When the welds broke, the wardrobe creaked open. It was empty, except for a thin layer of dust. But the floor inside looked subtly wrong. It was made of thick diamond plate steel, different from the smooth concrete outside. He ran his hand along the edge and found it. A tiny, barely visible seam. He located a recessed button, pressed it, and a square section of the diamond plate floor, the size of a small trap door, snapped open slightly. Beneath it was blackness, and cold. Not the ambient chill of an underground room, but a specific, bone-deep cold, like the unit was exhaling the temperature of deep space. Kai pulled out his phone, activated the strongest beam, and aimed it down the shaft. It was a tight, vertical chimney. Iron rungs, thick and ancient, disappeared into the abyss. The beam only illuminated maybe 25 feet before being swallowed by the absolute black. No sound, no smell, just that stream of profound cold air. Don't. His internal voice screamed the warning. Walk away, lock the door, sell the tools, and pretend this never happened. But the knowledge, the certainty that a bunker existed beneath a bunker, a secret beneath a secret, was too potent. He was already down $75 and half a tank of gas. Whatever was down there, he owned it. He clipped his phone to his belt loop, flashlight aimed down. He grabbed the largest tool from the workbench, a heavy, sickle-shaped device made of dark copper, its surface etched with symbols that resembled a blend of archaic astronomy and alchemical notation. He tucked it into his jacket. The descent was slow. The rungs were agonizingly cold through his work gloves, and they creaked a complaint with every inch he dropped. 40 feet. 50. The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer dry. It was damp, thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and something intensely acidic, like battery fluid or concentrated sorrow. He dropped onto a concrete floor. It was a true bunker. Square, small, with low ceilings reinforced by heavy timber beams. A single, long-dead incandescent bulb hung from a fraying wire. The walls were lined with industrial steel shelving, packed not with salvageable goods, but with research materials. To his left were thick, bound manuscripts, their covers made of hardened leather or thin sheets of metal. One caught his eye. It was blood red, bound in dark oak, and secured with 2 massive brass clasps that resembled raven claws. The title was etched into the spine in a forgotten script, but underneath, someone had stenciled in stark, black English, Codex Vermillion. Kai slid it from the shelf. It weighed easily 10 pounds. He opened it carefully on a small metal drafting table nearby. The pages weren't paper. They were vellum, almost translucent, covered in dense, spidery handwriting that looked like it had been scratched on with a stylus, not a pen. The first half was creature taxonomy, descriptions, weaknesses, and containment protocols for things Kai recognized from nightmares. Changelings, shadow mimics, corporeal voids. Then, halfway through, the tone changed. The writing became rushed, more panicked, interspersed with typewritten inserts that seemed to be direct field notes. A section was ringed in thick, frantic red ink. Project. Hades 7. Kai began to read, leaning over the table, the freezing air of the bunker forgotten. Project. Hades 7. The Archivist. Classification. Primary. Uncontained. Chronal parasitic. Description. Subject maintains the appearance of an aged human male, always wearing attire consistent with the late 1920s. Dark wool coat, fedora, polished boots. Height and build variable. Key distinction. The absence of a visible mouth. The lower face is smooth, uninterrupted skin. When manifesting intent, the skin tears into a grotesque, impossibly wide grin that separates the mandible from the cheekbones. This smile is never an expression, but an indication of harvest. Methodology: the harvest Hades 7 does not consume flesh. It consumes memory and consciousness. Subject enters the life cycle of a target, usually isolated individuals or small families, and observes them for several weeks. Upon harvest, the target's physical body is left intact, often still seated or lying down, but the neurological system is completely voided, a perfect empty shell. The target's consciousness is believed to be stored within the entity. Chronology: the Archivist operates on a strict 13-year cycle, tied to specific magnetic line nodes across the continental United States. The pattern is always room 7B at low-grade, cash-only motels, usually on the outskirts of towns with declining populations. Weaknesses: unknown. Counters: religious symbols, failed. Silver, failed. No direct physical contact established. Fire, failed. Telekinetically repelled. High-frequency electromagnetic pulse, ineffective. Entity generates its own temporal field. The typewritten notes gave way to the frantic handwriting again. This was the original hunter, the owner of the bunker. The man who had maintained the system since the 1990s. Kai could feel the terror in the scratched ink. He turned the page. It was a rough, charcoal sketch of the figure. No mouth, the face a blank canvas until the moment of the tear. Underneath, a new entry, dated recently, just 2 years ago. March 12, 2023. Location: Rusted Arrow Motel, Alabama. Room 7B. The cycle began early. He was there. The air felt heavy with the voices. Hundreds of them. I could hear them whispering in the dead air. His harvest was underway. I had the new Titan rounds. I waited for the 0 hour. Approached at 3 o'clock. Kicked in the door. He was standing in the center of the room, facing the wall, facing the emptiness. I fired 4 rounds center mass. Heard the distinct thud of the shell casing hitting the floor. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't bleed. He turned slowly. He walked toward me. I didn't run, couldn't. I saw the darkness, the impossible tear-like grin. The final paragraph was pressed onto the vellum so hard that the charcoal had smudged into the page, obscuring the letters. But Kai could make out the last carved line, etched with incredible force. He took my name. He is free. Kai's breath hitched in the freezing air. He backed away from the table, scanning the shadows. The bunker felt airtight, secure, yet the chilling certainty of the previous hunter's failure pressed down on him. He was holding the evidence of a decades-long war, and the last casualty was the only one who knew how to fight it. And now, Kai Stone, a man who couldn't even pay his rent on time, was holding the dead man's war plans. The clock on his phone showed 1:37 a.m. The battery was down to 10%. He had to get out, but he couldn't leave this here. He moved quickly, snatching the Codex Vermillion and stuffing it into his canvas backpack. He grabbed the heavy, copper-etched sickle, the censer, and secured it inside his coat. He took photos of the maps pinned to the wall, dozens of dots tracing a dark, 13-year route across the continent. The last dot was circled in blood-red ink. Texas Panhandle. Node active. 2024. He scrambled up the freezing iron ladder, heart hammering against his ribs. When he finally hauled himself out of the trap door, the regular concrete of the first bunker felt like a warm, welcoming sanctuary. He slammed the steel trap shut, locked the wardrobe, and didn't stop running until he had slammed the outer steel hatch and secured it with a massive, temporary chain he'd brought. Back in the stale, rusted air of Detroit, Kai sat in his truck and shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that this wasn't a score. This was a legacy, and he was the reluctant inheritor. The Archivist Hades 7 was on the move. He drove home, the heavy codex resting on the passenger seat, a 10-pound indictment of his miserable luck. He knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. He was a fireman. He ran towards the fire, even when the fire was a mouthless, ancient entity that stole souls. He opened the codex again, his fingers tracing the coordinates for the current active node. Texas Panhandle. Node active. 2024. The clock was ticking. He had to find out who was in room 7B now, and more importantly, who was in room 7A. The Texas Panhandle was a vast, silent basin of frozen prairie and flat horizon. It took Kai 42 hours of white-knuckle driving to reach the coordinates marked in the codex. He was running on stale coffee and adrenaline, his titanium knee throbbing with every mile. He had used the last of his savings to buy gas, canned rations, and a cheap pair of binoculars. The motel was exactly as the hunter's notes predicted. The Silver Star Motor Lodge, a single-story horseshoe of peeling brick and sun-bleached neon, far enough off the I-40 that only travelers desperate for a cheap bed would consider it. It was the epitome of a declining, cash-only operation. Kai checked into a room at a competitor 20 miles away, ensuring he kept his distance. Every night, he parked his truck half a mile from the Silver Star, concealed behind an unused billboard advertising a 20-year-old country concert. Room 7B was the last room on the right wing. Its window was covered not by curtains, but by sheets of plywood nailed from the inside. The manager, a gaunt man who seemed to exist solely on cigarettes and resentment, confirmed 7B was a long-term rental, prepaid in cash for 3 months. Quiet man. Never made eye contact. For 3 nights, Kai watched. The silence was absolute. No light, no sound, no movement from room 7B. But every night, exactly between 2:45 a.m. and 3:05 a.m., the streetlights surrounding that section of the motel would pulse. Not flicker, but a deep, subsonic throb, as if the local power grid was gasping for air. The air temperature would drop 20 degrees in seconds. The Archivist was active, drawing energy, preparing. On the 4th night, a new vehicle pulled into the lot around 11 p.m. A beat-up, late-model sedan with plates from Chicago. A woman emerged. She was young, probably mid-20s, with dark, severe hair pulled back in a loose braid. She wore oversized glasses and carried a worn, canvas backpack that looked too heavy for her frame. She looked less like a traveler and more like a student retreating from the world. She checked in, was given a key, and walked to the room right next to the plywood-sealed vault. Room 7A. Kai consulted the sparse, decade-old notes in the codex. The hunter had theorized that Hades 7 used proximity to initiate the harvest. The closer the target, the easier the extraction. Room 7A was the bullseye. He focused his thrift store binoculars on her window. The light came on. She moved slowly, meticulously unpacking a laptop and a stack of dense, foreign-language books. Vera Lysenko. The name he'd pulled from a public records search linked to the Chicago license plate. Student of linguistics. Alone. Unlucky. Perfect. Kai sat in his truck, the cold sinking into his bones, fighting the paralyzing sense of futility. He took my name. He is free. The hunter's final, carved warning echoed in his mind. The Titan rounds failed. The prayers failed. The Archivist wasn't a monster you killed. He was a phenomenon you contained, and the previous keeper failed containment. But watching Vera, a woman studying the very nature of human communication, being targeted by a creature that stole the essence of thought, Kai couldn't drive away. His left knee, the permanent reminder of his failure to save a single child from a burning building, screamed at him to act. He wouldn't fail another person. He waited until 1:45 a.m. The time was close enough to the 0 hour to be dangerous, but early enough that the Archivist's power draw wouldn't be absolute. He drove the truck to the parking lot entrance, walked the final quarter mile, and approached room 7A. His heart hammered a rhythm he hadn't heard since he was dragging hoses through smoke. He carried nothing but the codex in his backpack, a small packet of the specialized Copernicus resin in his pocket, and the heavy copper censer secured inside his jacket. He knocked. 3 quick, firm raps. A moment later, the door cracked open, held fast by a security chain. Vera's face, framed by the gap, was wary. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, immediately sizing him up as a threat or a nuisance. "Lodge is closed, I think," she said, her voice flat, carrying the faintest trace of an Eastern European accent. "My name is Kai Stone. I'm sorry to bother you, but I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds. I'm not selling anything. I'm not a cop. I'm not a creep." She didn't move. 58 seconds remaining. "I'm researching this location, specifically the room next to yours, 7B. The caution in her eyes deepened, becoming something closer to irritation. "And what is your research? Pest control?" "No. History. The man who rented that room is on a schedule. A cycle. He's here to take something from you." Kai pulled out his phone, scrolling to the photo he'd taken of the sketch in the Codex. "Look at him. This photo was drawn here, decades ago." Vera didn't reach for the phone, but her gaze locked onto the image of the man in the 1920s coat. She didn't look scared. She looked intensely focused, like a scholar finding an anomaly in a primary source. "No mouth," she murmured, her voice losing its flatness. "Just the void." "That's the Archivist," Kai whispered, leaning closer. "He doesn't want your life. He wants your mind, your memories. He keeps them. He harvests them." As Kai spoke the word harvest, the motel's outdoor environment seemed to flinch. The fluorescent bulb above their heads didn't burn out. It warped. The light flattened, stretching into a smear of purple and gray, accompanied by a sound like a wet sheet tearing. The electricity held, but the light was wrong. Vera didn't gasp. She stepped back, her hand fumbling for the security chain. "It started 3 days ago," she said, her accent thickening with tension. "The static, not electrical but cognitive, like a damaged transmission. Let me in, Vera. We need to leave." "Wait," she commanded, not letting him in, but not closing the door either. "You said he stores the consciousness. Where?" "In himself. The whole entity is a repository." "And how does he communicate?" "You said he spoke to the last hunter." "The hunter wrote he just said his name." Vera's eyes went wide behind her glasses. She let go of the chain. "No, that's not communication. That's retrieval." "He didn't speak it. He pulled it out of the hunter's own mind." She looked down the hall toward room 7B, the plywood door now looking obscenely solid. "He's not waiting for a conversation. He's running a defragmentation protocol." As if on cue, a low, wet sound began to emanate from behind the wall separating 7A and 7B. It wasn't scratching. It was a slow, sickening squelch, like mud being pressed through a tight sieve. Then came the sound that chilled Kai to the core. A low, resonant, inhuman hum. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in the human auditory range, felt more in the teeth and the chest cavity than the ear. Vera grabbed her keycard and pulled the door open, stepping out fully. Her academic curiosity had violently transformed into pure, survival-level analysis. "The wall," she pointed. "Look." The beige brick wall of the motel wing was still intact, but over the surface of room 7B's sealed window and door, dark lines were forming. They weren't cracks. They were wet, oily streaks of absolute blackness, oozing slowly from the seams between the bricks, pooling at the foundation like spilled crude oil. And then the whispers began. They didn't come from the wall. They came from everywhere. From the stagnant air, from the concrete beneath their feet, from the distant hum of the freeway. It wasn't one voice. It was a cacophony of disorganized syllables, fragmented phrases, and sudden, short bursts of laughter that ended abruptly, as if cut off by an internal censor. "Don't touch the blue one. Where did I leave my keys?" "Keys?" He promised, he promised, he promised. Mama's soup tastes like ash. The words washed over Kai, inducing instant nausea and vertigo. He felt the cold touch of hundreds of minds, each one a dead, archived thought trying to assert its presence through the conduit of the archivist. It's sound kinesis, Vera breathed, her hands covering her ears, but knowing it was useless. He's using the stored consciousness. He's projecting the residual linguistic energy. Kai grabbed her arm, his fingers tightening. The sensor. I have the sensor. We need to get far away. No, Vera said, shaking her head, her analytical mind still trying to solve the problem before running from it. It's too late. The magnetic field is too strong. We won't make it to the truck before he enters the physical space. The hum from 7B intensified, and the fluid black lines on the wall began to pulse in time with the sound. The air smelled sharp, like burning ozone and the faint, coppery scent of old blood. He is initiating harvest now, Kai forced out, pulling the copper censer from his jacket. It was a heavy, three-lobed sickle etched with the symbols of containment. He held it tightly, feeling the cold weight of the metal. We contain him long enough for the car to start. That's the plan. He looked up. The low motel roofline was casting deep, oily shadows. And standing at the far end of the parking lot, near the flickering neon sign of the Silver Star, was the silhouette. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, wearing a long coat that seemed to absorb the minimal light. It was standing perfectly still. But as Kai watched, the figure didn't walk forward. The entire shape seemed to be compressed in space, moving instantly from the sign to the second row of cars. The archivist was here, and it was coming for the memories. Now, Vera, Kai roared, shoving her toward her car. Get in. Lock the doors. Start the engine. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He turned, facing the silent, rapidly approaching figure, and fumbled in his pocket for the small packet of Copernicus resin. He had seconds before the impossible tear of the grin appeared. Vera didn't need a second command. Her analytic mind, honed by years of deciphering dead languages and complex linguistic patterns, instantly computed the terminal risk. She scrambled toward her Chicago sedan, fumbling the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice. A pathetic, strangled whine against the inhuman hum, now vibrating the entire motel foundation. Kai was alone. The archivist, Hades 7, had closed the distance with terrifying speed. It was no longer a shadow. It was a physical presence, standing 8 feet away, perfectly still. The man in the vintage coat. The fedora's brim cast his upper face in perpetual liquid darkness, but the lower face was a smooth, unsettling expanse of skin, like polished marble, completely devoid of features. It emanated a cold that promised not death, but absolute permanent deletion. The whispers intensified, assaulting Kai's mind. They were now coalescing into recognizable, painful pleas. The last check, I needed to cash the last check. Tell Sarah I loved her. I was only waiting for the spring thaw. Kai felt a psychic pressure, a probing sensation at the back of his skull, like the archivist was trying to locate the specific folder labeled Kai Stone in his brain's hard drive. He knew the Titan rounds failed. He knew bullets were useless. The hunter's notes were explicit. Containment, not destruction. He ripped the packet of Copernicus resin from his pocket. It wasn't powder. It was a cluster of dull, petrified sap, dark green and smelling faintly of ozone and ancient spice. He placed the heavy copper censer on the asphalt. The censer wasn't a burner. It was a 3-lobed, open bowl attached to a sickle-like handle, designed to channel specific resonant frequencies. With trembling fingers, Kai placed the resin into the bowl and pulled a lighter from his jacket pocket. He held the flame to the resin. The archivist took a deliberate step forward. It didn't look angry. It looked impatient. The smooth skin of its lower face began to crease. Not like muscle, but like parchment being slowly, horrifically torn. Kai heard Vera's sedan engine finally catch with a reluctant, grinding roar. Too late. The tear began. From the center of the smooth expanse, a thin, black line spread laterally, stretching across the face toward the earlobes, widening into the impossible rictus grin. A gaping, internal void that seemed to pull all light and air inward. It was the face of absolute quiet horror. The moment the tear reached its zenith, the whispers stopped. The hundreds of voices were instantly reduced to one single, deafening cognitive scream aimed directly at Kai. He collapsed onto his knees, his hands flying to his head, feeling every piece of memory. His sister's wedding, the smell of smoke, the warmth of his first dog. Being catalogued, tagged, and pulled toward that black void of a mouth. This is it. This is the end of me. But the Copernicus resin finally ignited. It didn't burn with fire. It burst into a plume of dense, pale cerulean smoke. The smoke didn't rise. It dropped, heavy and viscous, hugging the asphalt and immediately flowing outward in a circular, expanding wave. As the smoke engulfed the censer, the heavy copper began to vibrate. The frequency wasn't audible. It was a bass pulse felt deep in the bone marrow. The ancient symbols etched into the copper began to glow with a dull, emerald light. The censer was working. The moment the cerulean smoke touched the fabric of the archivist's coat, the entity seized. It was like watching a film reel abruptly stop and shatter. The figure froze mid-stride, held perfectly rigid in the field of resonant, charged smoke. The single, cognitive scream of the archivist was violently fractured, returning to the disorganized chorus of hundreds of voices, now trapped within the smoke field. Kai, partially freed from the mental assault, gasped for air. He crawled backward, scrambling to stay outside the immediate perimeter of the smoke, which was now flowing toward the entity, thickening like vapor trying to cling to cold glass. Vera slammed the sedan into reverse, tires spitting gravel. She stopped the car next to Kai, throwing the passenger door open. "Get in! Get in now!" she screamed over the rising, frantic volume of trapped whispers. Kai scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. Vera floored the accelerator. The car fishtailed violently on the gravel, turning away from the motel wing. In the rearview mirror, Kai saw the archivist, still frozen, completely shrouded in the glowing, cerulean smoke. It wasn't defeated. It was contained. The smoke seemed to be locking its physical and chronological movement in place. But the archivist was nothing if not calculating. As the sedan cleared the parking lot and hit the empty road, speeding away from the motel, a final act of malice occurred. The frozen figure raised its impossibly thin right arm. The arm moved in slow motion, yet its action was instantaneous. From the edge of the entity's torn grin, a shard of pure, black, crystalline light detached itself. It wasn't physical. It was a directed spike of dark, archived memory. It flew across the 100 yards separating them and shattered against the rear window of Vera's sedan, precisely where Kai was sitting. The window didn't break. The dark shard passed through the glass as if it were air, slamming into the back of Kai's head, just above the nape of his neck. Kai didn't feel pain. He felt flood. A torrent of raw, undifferentiated neurological data slammed into his consciousness. Images of a cornfield burning under a midnight moon, the taste of cheap whiskey, the sound of a woman crying, all memories that were emphatically not his own. He cried out, a guttural sound of pure shock, collapsing into the seat. "Kai! What was that?" Vera yelled, glancing over, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as the car swerved across the empty road. Kai sat up slowly, clutching his head. He felt dizzy, nauseous, but strangely full. He tagged me," Kai whispered, his voice hoarse. "He archived a piece of a previous harvest victim inside me." Vera drove in silence for a minute, the tires humming on the cold asphalt. She pulled over 10 miles later, next to a field of wind turbines spinning slow, silent circles against the dawn. What does that mean, tagged? She asked, turning to face him. Her face was pale, but her eyes, though wide with shock, still held that sharp, calculating focus. Kai rubbed the back of his neck, where the shard had entered his mind. It means I'm a beacon. He knows exactly where I am now. He's going to come back for the censer, and for the memory he left with me. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the censer. The cerulean smoke was gone, the resin reduced to a fine, gray ash. The copper was vibrating slightly, humming a residual, deep chord. We contained him for now, Vera stated, already shifting her focus from survival to strategy. The censer worked by disrupting his field, probably due to the resonant copper alloy and the frequency of that resin. But you're right, he's coming. We need to get back to Detroit now. We need the rest of the hunter's gear and all his notes. We need to understand this fragment he gave you. Kai nodded, the strange, intrusive memories already beginning to settle into a cold, separate layer beneath his own thoughts. He could still hear them, too, the faint, distant echoes of the Archivist's chorus, now echoing inside his own skull. Detroit, Kai agreed, starting the car again. The bunker. We have a lot of reading to do. The drive back to Detroit was an agonizing blur of highway lights and shared silence. The atmosphere inside the sedan was thick with unasked questions and the invasive, alien presence inside Kai's mind. Vera drove with the meticulous focus of someone who had just survived a mathematical impossibility. She only spoke to check on Kai, or to direct him to reapply the bandages on his throbbing knee. Kai, however, was wrestling with an internal poltergeist. The memory shard the Archivist had implanted wasn't just data. It was a ghost. He saw flashes of a small, cluttered apartment, smelled stale cigarette smoke, and heard the rhythmic, hypnotic clack-clack-clack of a typewriter. He felt a profound sense of waiting for a phone call, a letter, a sign. The memories belonged to the man the previous hunter had called the harvest victim in room 7B. When they finally reached Detroit, the dilapidated warehouse felt less like a monument to failure and more like a fortress. They sealed the main steel hatch, descended the frozen ladder into the lower bunker, and spread the Codex Vermillion and the hunter's chaotic maps across the drafting table. He didn't tag you to track you, Vera said, her finger tracing a complex, hand-drawn magnetic field map in the codex. He contained you. He left a piece of his archive, a fragment of a soul in your mind. It's an insurance policy. If we tried to destroy the censer, he would claim the soul fragment and possibly your entire mind along with it. So I'm a time bomb, Kai muttered, rubbing his temples. The whispering chorus was fainter now, reduced to a dull murmur, but constant. No, Kai, you're a receiver, Vera corrected, adjusting her glasses. This fragment is a clue. The hunter's final notes implied he failed to save any of the archived souls. But what if they aren't truly archived? What if they are simply stored, waiting for the right frequency to be released? They spent the next 72 hours immersed in the previous hunter's world. Vera, with her linguistic expertise, deciphered the complex blend of Latin, Greek, and esoteric symbols the hunter had used to log his findings. She focused on the section dealing with the censer. The hunter had noted that the copper alloy used in the censer was not just a conduit for the Copernicus resin. It was a vibrational tuning fork. It operated on a specific frequency that temporarily disrupted Hades 7's chronological field, freezing it in place. Vera discovered a forgotten detail, hidden in the margin of a footnote about the resin. The smoke wasn't just a paralyzer. The vibrations of the censer created a cognitive buffer, a temporary, isolated space between the Archivist's core and the archived souls. Listen, Vera said, pointing to a diagram of a complicated celestial chart. The Archivist doesn't move randomly. He follows nodes, yes, but those nodes lead to places of high information density. Motels on the highway where people pass through quickly, libraries, data centers, newspaper archives. Kai's mind flashed with the intrusive memory. The clack 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 of a typewriter, the smell of old paper. The next location isn't a motel, Kai stated, confirming his intuition with the borrowed memory. It's a library, a huge old building. I can feel the waiting, the anticipation of all those quiet lives, all those stored stories. Vera cross-referenced the coordinates on the hunter's map with the new timeline. You're right. The final red dot isn't a motel. It's the Ashton Public Library in Providence, Rhode Island. The cycle began 6 months ago, and he's moving faster now, probably compensating for the time we contained him. If we stop him now, he'll just move again in 13 years, Kai said, staring at the map with a grim expression. And he'll take a piece of the next victim or a piece of me every time. Vera looked at the censor, then at Kai, whose face was etched with fatigue and the faint strain of holding back 1,000 murmuring voices. We don't defeat him by destroying him, Kai. We defeat him by depleting his archive, Vera said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. The hunter failed because he focused on the fight. We need to focus on the rescue. She grabbed the heavy, blood-red codex. We know the censor creates a temporary buffer. We know the archivist is attracted to information density. We need to turn the censor from a containment device into a release mechanism. Kai nodded, the idea clicking into place. His time as a firefighter resurfaced. It wasn't about fighting the flames, but about finding the vulnerable, isolating them, and pulling them to safety. We go to the Ashton Library, Kai said, checking the meager supply of Copernicus resin they had left. We get close enough to the archivist for him to manifest and try to claim the memory he left with me. We use the memory fragment as bait. Vera finished his thought. When the archivist establishes a cognitive connection with the shard inside you, we ignite the censor. The resonant frequency will disrupt the connection and, instead of containing him, we use the buffer to create an escape route for the souls he has stored. Kai felt a surge of energy, the first genuine sense of purpose he'd had since his injury. The mission wasn't to save the world, but to save the hundreds of forgotten lives trapped inside a silent monster. We can't save the dead, Vera repeated, quoting their new mantra, but we can free them, and we must prevent the next archiving. Kai carefully resecured the censor and the last of the resin into the hunter's specialized pack. He looked at Vera, who stood beside him, a linguist turned warrior, ready to face an entity that violated the very structure of human thought. Providence, Kai said, zipping the pack shut. Let's go. They climbed out of the bunker, sealing the hatches behind them. The Detroit air, cold and industrial, now felt like the air of home, a temporary haven before the next confrontation. They were no longer the reluctant inheritor and the accidental victim. They were the architects of the aftermath, the only line of defense against a silence that tried to steal every human story. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, Kai Stone knew exactly what he was running towards.